About 2 months ago, I talked to the former commander of the US Army, Ben Hodges, about a potential war between Russia and Ukraine. 2 months later, today, in the middle of April, we are having a present war between those two countries. And we hear that many Western nations are supporting Ukraine with weapons and with money. And I was wondering, Ben, if you could explain to me whether the $800 million are enough, are a lot or a little in order for Ukraine to fight against Russia.
Wlad, 800 million is a lot of money, but it's not enough, and it's late. Here we are, we're in almost 8 weeks into this war now, or this latest Russian attack, actually. Of course, the war's been going on since 2014, and I still have not seen the sense of urgency from the administration or many other countries that's necessary for Ukraine to win. That's what we need to hear. People talk about winning, not getting to a settlement. I mean, so much has already been lost. I don't think many Ukrainians are interested in just getting to a settlement, but they want to restore their sovereignty, what they've been fighting for. Otherwise, so many lives that have been lost and the billions of dollars of damage would be perhaps for nothing. So what I'm more interested in is not how many tons of equipment or how many planes have arrived or how much money has been spent, but has the actual capability that Ukraine needs to win, has it been delivered yet? And I would say no. They need more long-range rockets and artillery, more drones. We should have never prevented Poland from giving the MiGs that they wanted to give, because what's causing all the damage in Ukraine in murdering innocent Ukrainian civilians are rockets and artillery and missiles coming from a long distance away, and including from ships. So helping Ukraine destroy and disrupt those things has got to be the priority. That's what we've got to be pushing. We don't need any more lists. We know exactly the capabilities that they need. I would also say one last thing. This aid, it is, by the way, it's helpful. I mean, the things that are coming, more Switchblade drones, howitzers, some armored vehicles, these are not wasted. It's coming late, and it's not enough, because we want Ukraine to be able to take advantage right now of this opportunity as Russia tries to reconstitute and rebuild its forces from the pounding that they took in the first 7 weeks. Now is the time to get them.
And obviously, as a Ukrainian, I totally support everything that you say. However, in Germany and also in America, there are voices, also loud voices, that actually do not depict the Ukrainians as the good guys and the Russians as the bad guys. We all know Tucker Carlson, we know Fox News, and I'm really surprised that Republicans are also buying parts of Russian propaganda, especially about that the Russians are actually rescuing civilians, that the Russians are offering them safe corridors to flee into Russia from the bad and evil Ukrainian army and Ukrainian regime. What can you tell me about this divide, even in American politics, between Democrats and Republicans, between Fox News and CNN, about the propaganda that's going on? How is it possible that in this type of war, where one country actually tries to overthrow and annihilate the other, this one aggressor is not depicted as the bad guy by everybody?
It has astounded me that the party of Ronald Reagan has somehow now embraced the message from the Kremlin, and I can't figure it out. Actually, I think part of this is probably some Republicans see a political advantage if they can damage the Biden administration. I mean, so there's as is always the case on both sides. You know, people are looking for local, domestic political advantage. But I think there's something larger at work here that is really concerning to me personally, and to many other people that I work with, whom I work. The right-wing politics in America has come to embrace a more autocratic, less democratic form of government. I mean, seeking to consolidate power. I mean, CPAC, which you know is the major conservative political action committee, has their big meeting each year. They're meeting next month in Hungary with Orban as the keynote speaker. That there is astounding to me. So I don't know what's led to this, but I think it is a really dangerous tendency in American politics. And so I do everything I can to help educate and influence in the United States what's going on, why this matters, that this really is in Ukraine. This is about democracy versus autocracy. And that if we don't help defeat autocracy in Ukraine, then Russia is going to move on to other targets as well.
In one recent interview that was published 2-3 days ago, you said that this is not going to be over probably for another year, or maybe we should also think about the second year and the third year of war between Russia and Ukraine. And this is something that has not surprised me, because in the Donbas region, we already have kind of a Cold War between the Russian separatists and the Russian military and the Ukrainian national state. What now could probably happen is that that Russia will occupy a few other pieces of territory from the Ukraine and then turn them Russian, maybe even acknowledge them as independent states of Mariupol and other cities, maybe even Kharkov, the big city in the northeast. Can you imagine that piece by piece, like people are actually eating a cake, they're not eating the whole cake at once, but piece by piece, the strategy of Mr. Putin is actually to include Ukraine into the new Russian empire. And he doesn't want to do it all at once because it's too difficult. But like he did in Georgia, a little piece by piece, he could reassemble a little Soviet Union.
So I don't think he wants a new Soviet Union, but he definitely wants to return the Russian empire. That's the ultimate end state. And that means elimination of Ukraine as a viable state, that even the idea of a Ukrainian state, that's why you see this total destruction of cities. There's clearly no interest in protecting infrastructure for future economic use. It's reduced to dust. The deportation of thousands of Ukrainians into Russia from the occupied territories. I mean, this is something that Stalin would recognize immediately. And so what's underway is an attempt to completely Russify Ukraine. In Kherson and in Zaporizhia, you've got people are being forced to use rubles. The local governments are being pulled under Russian management. So I think you're right that there is an attempt to piece by piece take what they can. This is why it is so important that we talk in terms of winning, and that winning equals the following. Number one, Russia back to the pre-24 February line. So not 1 inch of Ukrainian territory that they have taken since 24 February, all back. Number two, the thousands of Ukrainians who have been kidnapped, deported, sent off to somewhere else in Russia, accounted for and returned home immediately. Number three, long-term commitment by the West, led by the United States, to full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty. That means Crimea and the entire Donbass. And then number four, break the back of the Russian military so that it can no longer threaten Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, or any other of its neighbors, including our Baltic allies. So this is, I think, specific definition of what winning looks like. And I need to hear my administration, I need to hear the British government, the German government, the French government talk about winning, not getting to settlement, but winning. Because if there is a settlement, then exactly what you've described, that's what's going to happen. The Russians will, whatever settlement, they'll be keeping everything they've taken. And then they'll just wait for us to lose interest. and next year it'll pick back up. That's why I said that the possibility of this thing going on and on is because the Ukrainians obviously are not just going to roll over. They're going to keep fighting. They're going to and they should keep fighting, and they're going to make the Russians bleed, and it's going to be ugly and as long as Russia occupies parts of Ukraine. I mean, this has been going on since 2014. I just read a ridiculous quote from the minority leader of the House, Mr. McCarthy, senior Republican in the House of Representatives. He said, if Biden had given weapons sooner to Ukraine, Russia would not have invaded. How stupid. Russia invaded 8 years ago. And so this is the level of thought, unfortunately, in some places. So we've got to start talking about winning. We got to start talking about democracy versus autocracy. And we got to make sure that Ukraine has the tools it needs to be able to do this.
Now, let's talk about the logistics of the war. Even I, as a total beginner in strategy of warfare, know that the weapons are coming from the West, obviously, from the regions like Poland, Romania, and others. And obviously, the weapons have somehow to get to the east of the country, where the next big attack is expected. Now, on the way from the West Ukraine to the east of Ukraine, it could be quite plausible that Russia will start to bomb all those deliveries of weapons, and they could also start to bomb not just right at the border of Ukraine, but maybe even start to bomb at the border of Poland or somewhere. And from the military perspective, that would also make total sense from the Russian perspective, because they want Ukraine not to use those weapons in the east. And also, there has been some statements that regard those deliveries of weapons as a hostile act. If we think at a little bit further, it's also possible that the NATO is going to be involved into an active war through the act of delivering those weapons, because those weapon deliveries are going to be attacked from air. How do you view the possibility or the probability of involvement of the NATO into this war, and obviously the threat of the Third World War connected to this?
I think the last thing the Russians want is a direct conflict with NATO. Even though it might make sense from a tactical standpoint to strike targets inside Poland, for example, or Romania or Slovakia, they're not going to do this, because then it changes everything. And now you've got 30 nations of NATO against Russia. In fact, I think the threat of escalation is exaggerated, and we've made some bad choices because of an exaggerated fear of escalation. I don't think the Russians are going to escalate at all. In fact, I don't think they're going to use a nuclear weapon. They could, but they won't resist doing it out of some humanitarian streak, but because it makes no sense for them to do it. There's no battlefield advantage, and there's no positive outcome for them. So that's why I think it's extremely unlikely that they would use a nuclear weapon. Now, of course, I always assumed that anything that we provide, once it got inside Ukraine, would be a target. I mean, that was kind of a so what when the Russians announced that. Like, well, of course it is. I mean, and we would assume that. And that's why you don't have Americans or British or German truck drivers or pilots delivering things. Everything, there are several different sites in Poland, Slovakia, and Romania from which things are being delivered. And it's coming in by rail, by convoy, even some air. So it's what we call multimodal, several different modes of transportation and sites. The Russians, I think they put 5 missiles into Lviv today. I don't know exactly where they impacted, but I mean, they've got the range with some weapons to strike along the railroads or the highways where some of these convoys might be. But I don't know how much more ammunition they have. I mean, they have fired so many missiles. I also don't believe that they have the ability right now to do what we call dynamic targeting, which is to pick up a convoy and then be able to strike it with a long-range weapon, at least not consistently. So perhaps they're just going to keep up their medieval destruction of cities, murdering civilians, firing into the towns, because it would require some real organization and skill to interdict the lines of what we call the lines of communication, the supply lines that go from the West into Ukraine. And I don't think they've got the ability to do that, not in a significant way. So in the meanwhile, there is a steady delivery, somewhere between 8 and 10 plane loads a day arriving in Poland and other places, loaded with equipment and so on. But there probably needs to be about 20, not just 10. So getting it into the hands of Ukrainians here over the next 2 weeks, I think, is going to be decisive.
And at the end of the interview, let me ask you the question of relevance. I think I even asked you that in our first interview. Why Ukraine? Why is Ukraine so important? Because we've seen over the last 20 years wars in Iraq. Nobody said that the war in Iraq is the clash of autocracy versus democracy. We saw a war in Syria. Nobody said that that was a global clash of civilizations. But to me, it seems like this war is becoming a type of clash of this autocracy versus democratic civilization. And you mentioned it, I think, 10 minutes ago, that this war will kind of decide, at least not forever, but for the next couple of decades, which type of government the world will face. And I'm really wondering, why Ukraine? Why does this country is the decisive factor? And that would be kind of interesting for everybody who does not care about Ukraine, because it's simply a land somewhere between Eastern Europe and Russia.
Well, you make a very good point, and some people have criticized me for not speaking out more loudly about other wars, in Yemen, for example, or in Africa, and somehow implying that this is that there's some ulterior motive. But for me, this really is about democracy versus autocracy. I mean, President Putin, his government, and everything he's done over the last 20 years is 100% about smashing democracies and not allowing countries on the periphery of Russia to develop as liberal democracies, because he hates that, number one. And also, he doesn't want Russians to look across the border and say, wow, look how good life is in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. And that's why the Ukrainians want it. He doesn't want his own people to want that. That's the biggest threat to him. So I think that what we're seeing is the use of raw force, incredible lethality and brutality, the murder, flat out execution of innocent people that's the whole world has witnessed now. And it's going to continue if we don't stop it here. So this is a war for Europe that's being fought in Ukraine right now, but it could go further. It also has implications because the Chinese are watching. And if they see that the United States, with all of our allies, all the economic, diplomatic, and military power of 30 nations, plus other partners, cannot stop Russia in Ukraine, then I don't think they're going to be too impressed with anything that we say about Taiwan or the South China Sea, which will be much more difficult for us because of the distances involved. So this has a lot of implications, but at the end of the day, it really does boil down to, the side that supports people wanting to make their own choices. Ukraine is the only country where somebody died with an EU flag in their hand. This is what people want, and to be able to make their own choices. And I think this is worth us fighting for.
Now, normally this topic would be too serious to make a cheap book promotion, but in your case, it's slightly different. Shortly before the war, there has been a book that came out in German. It's called Future War, and you speak about the European kind of distancing themselves, thinking in war terms and thinking about winning. My very last question is, if people read this book, Future War, that could be renamed Present War, unfortunately, but if people read this book, if my German audience reads this book, what can they expect to learn in this book that they probably didn't learn in school?
Well, a reminder that the best way to prevent war is to be prepared for war. I mean, we know this for centuries. And Europe and the United States, we took a holiday, the so-called peace dividend, because we really thought after the fall of the Soviet Union that everybody was going to get along great. And we were just so naive. And most of Russia's attacks happened after we hit the bottom. The Bundeswehr, the US Army in Europe, the Brits, everybody, we practically disarmed. And so our book, which I wrote with Professor Julian Lindley French and General John Allen, is a call to arms to our European allies to take more responsibility for defense if we want to protect this incredible wealth and quality of life that Europeans and Americans enjoy.
Das war also das Interview mit dem ehemaligen Oberbefehlshaber der US-Armee in Europa, Ben Hodges. Und jetzt bist du gefragt, lieber Zuschauer, liebe Zuschauerin. Glaubst du, dass er recht hat, dass der Westen zu wenig tut, dass der Westen mehr Geld und mehr Waffen an die Ukraine liefern sollte, damit der Krieg in dieser entscheidenden Phase von den Ukrainern gewonnen wird? Oder hast du eine andere Auffassung? Hier bei Menschen überzeugen sind alle Argumente und alle Auffassungen willkommen. Schreib mir deine Meinung natürlich wie immer unten in die Kommentare. Und falls dich mein erstes Interview mit Ben Hodges interessiert, findest du den Link oben unter diesem Video, da wo ich mit ihm im Februar 2022 gesprochen habe. Ich hoffe, das Interview hat dir gefallen. Wenn ja, dann gib mir doch einen Daumen hoch, abonniere diesen Kanal für weitere spannende Gäste und weitere umstrittene und spannende Themen. Bis bald, dein Wlad.